Oh, 40% of 25 is the same as 25% of 40. After all these years, I finally.
Do you think you're middle class? If you're American, there's a pretty good chance that you do. In a survey conducted by the Pew Research Center in 2015, 87% of those surveyed identified themselves as middle class. That's a pretty big middle, but your intuition about what the middle class is, like who it includes and what constitutes a middle class lifestyle, probably isn't the full picture. And a lot of questions that sociologists try to answer are questions just like this. Questions that you think you know the answer to already. Many a person has played the armchair sociologist at some point in their lives, starting off about how they think society really works because of their own experience, or the experience of their friends, brothers, roommate. We all do it, but having personal opinions about the world doesn't make you a sociologist. Sorry. This is where sociological research comes in. It helps us understand society's patterns even when they go against our intuitions. Rather than using our gut to answer questions, we use a research method. A systematic plan for gathering and analyzing observations about the world. This is where we're going to learn how to do sociology. First things first, research starts with a question. And the key to deciding on a question is defining the concepts that you're studying and making sure that both you and your audience agree on what those concepts mean. It's like that thing with the dress. Some people thought it looked black and blue, and other people thought it looked white and gold. It turns out that some things that seem totally objective just aren't. And this becomes infinitely more complicated when you replace the concepts of blue or gold with concepts like the economy, poverty, parenting, education, or love. So what if the way I am defining poverty isn't how you're imagining poverty? What if we're all seeing different levels of well-being as poor, but we refer to them all as poverty? That won't work. So you have to define your concept, which becomes even more important when you get to the next part of the research process, stating a hypothesis, a statement of a possible relationship between two variables. A variable is just something that can take on many different values. It varies, hence the name. So before you can assign a value to a variable, you have to operationalize it. That is, you have to define the exact variable you're going to measure and exactly how you will measure it. For example, you can operationalize a variable that you want to use to understand relationships by defining it as reported marital status. Only then can you assign each person in your sample a number corresponding to their relationship status, like 0 if they're married, 1 if they're divorced, 2 if they've never been married, etc., until every person is labeled. And what value a variable takes on is called its measurement. You can measure someone's height, you can measure someone's income, and you can measure someone's relationship status. It doesn't matter how many categories your variable has, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever. What's important is that the way you define your categories is both reliable and valid. Suppose you decide to use Facebook relationship status as your measure of relationship status among your subjects. For your measurement to be reliable, you have to be consistent in how you measure the variable. So here's what not to do. Say you have 2 categories for relationship status, single or not single. 2 different sociologists are going through the data, assigning values based on Facebook status. One decides that people who say it's complicated get the label not single, while the other decides that these people should be called single. That's not consistent. Every person with the same characteristics, in this case, the same relationship status, needs to be assigned the same value. And in order for your measurement to be valid, it has to actually measure something that directly reflects the concept that you're trying to study. Facebook relationship status may be a useful measure of whether someone's single or not, but it's not a valid measure of, say, their political views. Once you know how you want to measure your variables, your hypothesis will be an educated guess about how they're related, often using an if-then statement. Here's an example of a hypothesis based on what I was talking about earlier. If someone lives in a city, then they are less likely to refer to themselves as middle class. In this case, geographic location is what we call the independent variable. It's the variable that we think is affecting the change in how people describe themselves. But you can also have variables that you believe are affected by changes in your independent variable. These are your dependent variables. Your hypothesis is that they change when the independent variable changes. But you have to be careful because correlation does not always equal causation. Correlation is what happens when 2 variables move together. It can be easy to misinterpret.
Okay, hi everyone. So of course, that's one of the many resources on YouTube, an introduction to sociology. Of course, starting off with a perspective that looks like it's quantitative sociology, sociological methods. It's worth watching this series. I've gotten some useful information from it in my own work. Okay, so let's go to the lesson plan and make sure that that's available and make sure that we're understand what we have to worry about or focus on here. Of course, your final exam paper is due, your first draft is due on Saturday for me to put comments on and send it back to you. And we have a debate on Friday, and I think only one person signed up, Yi Ju Young, so it'll be me that will be the opposition, unless I do this really quickly and check my Google account and find out what it says, if somebody else might have chosen to sign up since I made that assignment. So make sure, again, you can see this. And so we go through here, we go to here, methodology under my Google account. And so we scroll down. Yes, so far, nobody else has signed up. So I will be Khan on the debate topic. South Korea's growing cultural diversity would make it more competitive globally. Hooray! Okay, so that's the debate topic in the paragraphs of the Thursday and tomorrow morning, right? Okay, so, and again, let's close that and go back to the lesson plan. And so I'm going to share screen here, share screen on lesson plan. And there you see the lesson plan. And before I forget, why don't we go ahead and do the attendance? And so we go to share screen and go to, of course, I don't see the screen coming up. So just a second here. So let me go to Cyber Campus and open that up. And then now go to, go back, close that. And then we go back to share screen and see comes up. There it is. So we go click there. And there you see your smart attendance number, 731. 731 is your smart attendance number. So let me put that in the chat box, 731. There you go, 731 is your smart attendance number, okay? And now that's out of the way. Then we go back to the to the lesson plan. And well, there's not really much more to cover in lesson plan other than just to remind you that the final exam, of course, is due Saturday. And then we're going to cover here chapter 16 and 17 of Trompenaars and Turner. And so here I have some other links on the YouTube regarding YouTube introductions to sociology, sociological concepts, and so on, which maybe I'll post them in case you're interested in looking at them. And okay, so then let's go back to the oh, I know what I want to talk. I wanted to talk, I think, is Gloria here? I got to make sure Gloria's here, because I asked Gloria at the last class if, and I don't see her here. Well, maybe I won't talk to Gloria. I don't see, she's not here. Oh, well, then I won't bring it up. Okay, so let's go back then to the notes. Yes, the notes. So we go to Trompenaars and Hampton Turner, 16 and 17, and maybe also to keep you really focused or interested on how all of this material works. Let's do something that focuses on a current event or current issue. I saw something very interesting in the news today regarding that illustrates some of the points that we wanted to highlight in the class, and that is states and nations as basically vast organizations. That's all they are, right? States are organizations on a vast scale. And some of these organizations, people feel very strongly about, particularly if they tend to believe that everybody living, or the overwhelming majority of people living within the boundaries, the territorial boundaries of an existing state, all share the same primary terminal self-identity community that corresponds, and that community corresponds in their own thinking and their own views with the territorial community bounded by the state. And we call that a nation state. Hooray! And there are some nation states. No nation state is perfect in that, for example, there are elements of Polish nation that live outside of Poland in Lviv, for example. And of course, the Russian nationalists are claiming that Poland wants to annex part of Western Ukraine to Poland. Not all Bulgarians live within Bulgaria in the view of a Bulgarian nationalist, but there are some countries that come close, and Japan and Norway, right, are empirical examples of nation states that come close to being the ideal image of a nation state. But to highlight, the reason I mentioned this issue about culture and nations in relation to culture is that nationalism is a way by which to understand the influence of culture in international politics. In terms of propagating and desiring respect and dignity and dominance for one's identity as a member of a community that I associate with being a nation. And but to step back from that, because this is a topic that's really a focus in my other classes, about how still American culture is different from obviously Korean culture, Japanese culture, Cambodian culture, and as manifested, for example, in measured or compared, I should say, compared in the Trompe-Meyers-Hampton-Turner book among their 7 value continuums, right? And of course, when we put those 7 together, we get a national culture. And just again to illustrate the differences in values and attitudes, or values and norms. And norms are ways that people believe they should behave, and values that are expressed by Trompe-Meyers-Hampton in terms of what people think how they ought to behave. So how they should behave and how they ought to behave might be different, right? Or how they desire to behave, I should say, how they desire to be. Values are more idealistic, but norms are more pragmatic and real world focused. Whereas values, according to Trompe-Meyers-Hampton-Turner, are those ideals we have in our minds collectively about what it means to be an American. So again, Americans love the rugged individual, right? The cowboy on the frontier who takes care of himself, doesn't like big government, doesn't look to big government. That's an American value. The cowboy, and it's represented in art and aesthetics and commercial pop culture, like in films, in the Western, with the American cowboy, right? And it's a stereotype. It's a romantic self-image. It's not accurate, but it is part of the symbol set that Americans use to make themselves feel sharing a common identity, right? And of course, the appeal of it is reflected in many ways, including in popular media and films, the Western media, for example. But I won't go into that topic right now. But it's a stereotype, and versus, of course, people in Asia and in continental Europe, they're more likely to view themselves in a more communal orientation, right? That we do understand there is a state, and the state should play a leading role in society. There's really not a doubt about that. Even if an American living in the United States interacts with and works with the American federal authorities, the state authorities all the time, the romantic self-image of Americans doesn't necessarily correspond with the actual norms of behavior. And of course, Trompe-Meyers and Hampton-Turner make that point, that when these norms and values begin to diverge too much, it can lead to tension and conflict and possibly system breakdown and revolution, right? And we might see elements of that in the United States today, that we have this romantic self-image, regardless of its sources in racism and imperialism and settler colonialism based upon institutionalized racism, but that makes it more, that it really is a source of these foundations for white nationalist identity in the United States. That basically we want to see a world in which basically Western Christian Anglo-Saxon values justify and explain why it's permissible to import enslaved people from Africa, right? And to continue to hold them as property. And of course, these conflicts between the values of America regarding individual human rights and dignity and so forth versus the norms of reality led to the Civil War in the United States case, right? And that's an example of system breakdown, right? System breakdown that produces, a revolutionary changes in the system to recalibrate and reach a new equilibrium. So that's history. But in terms of this class, which we focused a lot on globalization in the early 21st century, this is a editorial in the New York Times. You remember, the most influential news medium in the United States, by a person who describes himself as a liberal. So he's a columnist for the New York Times. And you can't get much more influential than that as an opinion writer. And he's calling for the United States to adopt an industrial policy. And of course, that the United States, the argument is that the United States should consider explicitly adopting an industrial policy, a policy by the US government to promote the development of national industry. And that might seem kind of obvious to Koreans or Japanese or Chinese or Germans, that, well, yeah, I mean, we kind of expect the government to, play a leading role in making our country prosperous and economically strong and prosperous, to give well-being to people so they have jobs and there's money, yeah, of course, right? But the Americans, they don't believe that. Their implicit romantic national archetypes is that the economy is a natural thing that exists outside of the government. That the state does not play a leading role in the economy. That the economy and the marketplace and functioning is a natural process. And you need a government only at a minimal night watchman level. That's the so-called night watchman state, according to liberalism. Namely, you need a government because you need a police force, you need a court system, you need a prison system, and every once in a while, you need to form an army to fight bad countries. But it shouldn't be a permanent, professional, big military. Only when you need to go to war against an evil enemy. So, and so this highlights how now that we're in the era of climate change and clearly, increasingly evident and apparent interdependency between what happens in China versus affecting people that live in the United States versus affecting people in South Korea or affecting people in Belgium or affecting people in France, that, you know, for example, with the pandemic, right? That we are all hearing about how we have to address the pandemic, Corona-19 pandemic everywhere around the world, because if we don't, as the virus continues to be transmitted, it's going to mutate, and sooner or later we'll all get sick again, or we'll be challenged by new forms of the virus. So we can't say that, you know, we can fix the pandemic and address the Corona-19 pandemic in the United States and then our problem is done. Because when it's not done, we will again be influenced as long as the virus continues to thrive and be transmitted in other parts of the world. So we have to be concerned about what's going on in other parts of the world and work with those other governments and countries and even give them aid and assistance, including technology and money to help them battle the pandemic. And this might be something which is more understandable to some people, but to Americans, to many Americans, this is outrageous. Like, I don't want to care about other people because we're not related to each other. We're not interdependent, but of course they are interdependent. We've always been interdependent. But Americans have this romantic stereotype of the cowboy, the rugged individualist cowboy on the frontier who takes care of himself. And but of course, now we're talking about environmental policy and climate change, and that global climate change caused by human activity cannot be restricted or controlled with all of its negative consequences if we fail unless we work together. The United States, with Europe, with China, with India, with Russia, all of these countries, we have to work together, at least on some level, to restrict climate greenhouse gas emissions. If we're going to prevent catastrophes from occurring with increasing capacity, with big impacts around the world in many, 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 many different ways. Like, for example, with more droughts and famines, which means more migration, with more people trying to get in the United States, trying to get into Europe because they're fleeing famine and hunger and chaos in their home countries due to natural disasters. So there are many, many ways this impacts on the United States. And so this article highlights how that Joe Biden, who's the president of the United States, is trying to push the country towards adopting what would we call in other countries an industrial policy. It says here, you cannot transform the US economy without first transforming the government. In April, Brian Deese, the director of Biden's National Economic Council, gave an important speech on the need for a modern American industrial strategy. This was a salvo in a debate most Americans would probably be puzzled to know Democrats are having. Why are they puzzled? Because, again, Americans don't believe that the government plays a role in making the economy fundamentally function. Industrial strategy is an idea that a country should chart a path to productive capacity beyond what the market would on its own support. It is a belief that there should be some politics in our economics, some vision of what we are trying to make beyond what financial markets reward. Trying to build clean energy infrastructure is a form of industrial strategy. So is investing in domestic supply chains for vaccines and masks and microchips. For decades, the idea has been disreputable, even among Democrats. You don't want government picking winners and losers, as the adage goes. But of course, the South Korean government is all about doing that. I mean, the South Korean government made a commitment years ago. They're going to work in biotech and digital economics. And of course, now South Korea is one of the leaders in terms of internet capacity. right? South Korea is the fastest internet in the world. Why? In part because the South Korean government made a commitment into an industrial strategy focusing on developing South Korea's digital economic capacity, right? What's the subway station on the subway line? One of the Kasan Digital Complex, right? There you go, industrial strategy, right? The argument, but this is back to the United States. The argument basically is this: when governments bet on technologies or companies, they typically bet wrong. Markets are more efficient, more adaptable, less corrupt, and so governments should, where possible, get out of the market's way. That's the American stereotype, Trump and ours Hampton Turner romantic self-image view that you start with when you're dealing with Americans. The government's proper role is, after the market has done its work, shifting money from those who have it to those who need it. Put simply, markets create, governments tax, and politicians spend. It's remarkable, the assumptions that look beneath what's taken for common sense in Washington. Common sense, right? Trump and Hampton Turner talk about that. What's your culture is what you just implicitly know as common sense. It's just common sense. You don't need that. You just know it. It's in your heart. That's culture. Consider the phrases winners and losers. Winners at what? Losers how? Markets manage such questions through profits and losses, valuations and bankruptcies, but societies have richer, more complex goals, like defeating North Korea, like reunifying the Korean Peninsula, and then beating Japan, like industrializing China and reunifying China with Taiwan, like making South Korea a global leader as quickly as possible, going in my lifetime from being one of the poorest countries in the world to one of the richest in 60 years. To criticize markets for failing to achieve them is like berating a toaster because it never produces an oil painting. That's not its job. So, but getting the Americans to understand that they basically have to consider industrial policy is difficult. But the point I want to make, even in this article just highlights to me something amazing. America has had a de facto industrial policy, not officially, unofficially, but very big in the form of the Cold War defense establishment and defense policy against the Soviet Union since the late 1940s, or even going before then, during World War II, up until now. I mean, at the end of World War II, with the US government leading and coordinating and directing the US economic firms, including General Motors and Boeing, to supply the world to defeat Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, was in fact an industrial policy. So that by the end of World War II, 11% of manufacturing jobs in the United States were in aerospace in 1945. 11% of American manufacturing is making planes. And so what happened after the war was over? Boeing dominates the world's aeronautical industry. Boeing, you know, they make 747, 787, 777s, all those planes you fly in when you go somewhere. And then, of course, World War II ended, and then the American government began to move away from the economy. But then, of course, the Korean War began. When the Korean War began, then we go back to American big Cold War defense policy, promoting economic, technological developments and development of American capacities to fight and win the Cold War against the Soviet Union and communism. And this continued for decades and produced also beyond the Defense Department, you know, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, the space program. And all of these programs were meant to win the Cold War, to develop the military technological capacity in the United States, to make sure that we never have to fight a nuclear war by having advanced technologies that are far superior to what the Soviet Union has or could develop, to race with the Soviet Union, to get to the moon first, to show you, Korea, and everybody else in the world that the American system is the best system. And how do you know it's the best system? Not by fighting World War III, because that's suicidal in the nuclear age, by getting to the moon first, and not once, 5 times. And develop all these new technologies. All of these new technologies were developed with the American government's support to build the space program to get to the moon and back. That would not have happened without the US government directing and guiding and funding all of these thousands and thousands of businesses that were created, developed, and emerged during the Cold War. And there's no mention of that in this article. I mean, the semiconductor was developed by the Defense Department. You know, the foundation for modern computers, the semiconductor. The internet was developed with the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency in the Defense Department, DARPA. The internet, for Christ's sake. But the Americans, they collectively, what defense industrial policy? We don't have an industrial policy. No. It's there. It's always been there. We just don't call it industrial policy. The Japanese do. The Koreans do. The Germans do. But we don't. But we have it. And that's one of the reasons why the United States is so influential around the world. And it's not mentioned in this article. Like, he never mentions the Defense Department. He never mentions the space program. He never mentions Boeing getting all of this guaranteed market access, guaranteed customers are going to buy what Boeing produced that allowed Boeing to have a long-term investment strategy to develop jet plane technology, because they always knew they were going to make money because the US Defense Department would buy their products. And it wasn't going to buy French products or German products or Italian products or Japanese products. It was going to buy American companies. And it just amazes me. Like, this desire, how much our desire to feel good about my identity in the form of my cultural community that I share with my other fellow co-members, co-nationals. We share culture to see the world in a way that allows me to feel good about being who I am. And that means not seeing the fact that America has always had an industrial strategy. Even if I don't want to admit it. And so I have to argue for this, right? But what about the Cold War? And the hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars that were spent on new technologies to fight and win the Cold War. The new technologies and the industrial capacities, infrastructure to support them, right? So, I mean, I'm always stunned when I read these articles, but they make the point about how, you know, the Americans, because it's necessary to include, he's arguing here, a better understanding of the essential role of the government in making industrial development and change happen, right? So he says the first step is admitting that we have a problem in the United States, because if we don't acknowledge that the state does play an important role in developing the economy, then we're not going to understand how to do it as effectively as we could. The first step is admitting you have a problem, and these, to his credit, did exactly that. A modern American industrial strategy needs to demonstrate that America can build fast as we've done before and fairly as we've sometimes failed to do, he said. He noted that the Empire State Building was constructed in just over a year. We are richer than we were then, and our technology far outpaces what was available in 1930. And yet, does anyone seriously believe that such a project would take a year today? One answer, the typical Republican answer, is that government can't do the job and shouldn't try. But the data don't bear that out. The transit cost project tracks the price tags on rail projects in different countries. It's hard to get an apples to apples comparison here because different projects are, well, different. And it matters whether they include, say, a tunnel, which is expensive for all the obvious reasons. Even so, the United States is notable for how much we spend on how little we get. It costs about $538 million to build a kilometer of railroad here in the United States. Germany builds a kilometer of railroad for $287 million. Canada gets it done for $254 million. Japan spends $170 million to build a kilometer of railroad. Spain is the cheapest country in the database at $80 million to build a kilometer of railroad. All these countries build more tunnels than we do, perhaps because they retain the confidence to regularly try. The better you are at building infrastructure, the more ambitious you can be when imagining infrastructure to build. The problem isn't government, it's our government. Nor is the problem unions, trade unions, labor unions, another favored bugaboo of the right, right? Union density is higher in all those countries than it is in the United States. So what has gone wrong here? One answer worth wrestling with was offered by Brink Lindsay, the director of the Open Society Project at Niskanen Center, in a 2021 paper titled State Capacity. What is it, how we lost it, and how to get it back? His definition is admirably terse. State capacity is the ability to design and execute policy effectively, he told me. When a government can't collect the taxes it's owed, or build the sign-up portal for its new health insurance plan, or construct the high-speed rail it's already spent billions of dollars on, that's a failure of state capacity. So we need to talk about this in the United States to build our state capacity, particularly if we're going to compete more with China, right? And that's always the subtext. China, China, China. China's doing what South Korea did in developing rapidly, but China's got, of course, 50 times more people than South Korea. And it's a communist republic. What is needed most is a change in ideas, namely a reversal of those intellectual trends of the past 50 years or so that brought us to the current pass. On the right, this means abandoning the knee-jerk anti-statism of recent decades in the United States, embracing legitimacy of a large, complex welfare and regulatory state, and recognizing the vital role played by the nation's public servants, not just the military, police and military. Okay, there's some element, we always have a respect for military, right? Even John Locke, the classical liberal theorist that played such an important role in American identity and culture, right, recognized that sometimes you have to have a big military. On the left, it means reconsidering the decentralized, the legalistic model of governance that has guided progressive-led state expansion since the 1960s, reducing the veto power that activist groups exercise in the courts, and shifting the focus of policy design from ensuring that policy is subject to progressive checks to ensuring that power can be exercised effectively. And so it goes on here. Well, I don't know if I really want to cover this, but again, the focus that the Americans have on procedure rather than on outcomes. The focus of Americans on process and not on outcomes, right? And that goes back to what Trump and Hampton Turner focus on, how the Americans believe that if you follow the universalistic rules of conflict resolution, the outcome is necessarily correct, right? That Trump and Hampton Turner emphasize how Americans have this tremendous number of courts, and that these disputes have to be regulated and resolved within the court system. Right. He argues again that Americans have a preference for legitimating government action through processes rather than outcomes. This is a way that America differs from peer countries. Robert Kagan, a law professor at the University of California, Berkeley, has called this adversarial legalism and shown that it's a distinctly American way of checking state power. So, okay, so just to show you, again, an example of no discussion in here about the de facto fast industrial policy the Americans had during the long Cold War, right, with the Soviet Union, because they couldn't fight their war directly and determine it in a space of a few years. For example, the way the Americans beat Japan or beat Germany, helped beat Germany in a few years. No, now we have to compete indirectly in the nuclear era, because if great powers go to war with each other, it's suicide with nuclear weapons, right? So they have to compete indirectly. And that lasted from the late 1940s until 1991, so almost 50 years. And that explains why I'm here and you're here in this classroom right now. The Cold War. So, but I just amazing that no mention here of what the United States has done during the Cold War in the form of defense policy. Okay, so I just wanted to cover that, and then we go to let me see if what has happened here. So let's go back to the notes. Well, let's see here. Maybe let's see what else I have lined up here in terms of activities. I don't think I do have anything lined up. Oh, okay. Okay, so So let's go back and talk about the notes. Okay, so for the chapter this week, and make sure you can see those notes. And okay, so this is chapter 16 and 17, and reconciling cultural dilemmas. And keep that in mind, right? That this is about persuasion. You can't coerce people to do what they don't want to do. You need to convince them in a multicultural, international context, like a multinational corporation, that they want to accommodate diversity and work with the different cultural expectations, the different common sense ideas, the different common senses, the common sense of the different cultures, that you need to work with them and reconcile them, right? Because people feel very emotional about what is common sense, about, of course, what is the right way versus the wrong way to behave. So a theme throughout the book is that every country and every organization confronts certain universal dilemmas. The way in which a people approach these dilemmas expresses a nation's culture. We have learned to recognize these differences, to respect that cultures have the right of self-determination. So we have to not erase other cultures, we need to incorporate them. Not stereotype them as backward, as childlike, as lazy, as wrong, as bad. Now we must overcome the problems of misunderstanding that can easily arise. And yes, they easily arise. Right? Because, you know, if I'm your typical American, I'm going to assume, of course, that, you know, it's obvious that, you know, people should be paid individually for their performance. If they perform well, they should get more money. But others, as highlighted in the book, react very viscerally against that, including European culture, like the Italian culture. And there's millions of Italian Americans in the United States. So we must overcome the problems of misunderstanding that can easily arise, and keep that in mind, that if you're the boss in a company and you insult your employees inadvertently, not on purpose, by making certain assumptions about what's the right way to behave, and you appear to threaten them, even if you do not intend to, but you appear to threaten them because people's jobs, their careers are so important to them, and you appear to be punishing or penalizing them for being who they are, you got a problem if you're the boss, because they'll quickly lose trust in you. And if you lose trust in them, yeah, it's very difficult to get it back. So now we must overcome the problems of misunderstanding can easily arise, and we must exploit the business benefits of the different viewpoints. So view them, in fact, as being resources to be exploited effectively in these cultural differences. So we have to connect these viewpoints and secure the benefits that come from recognizing differences and respecting the right of self-determination. You know, if I was that Ezra Klein writing an editorial in the New York Times, I mean, I would have done a much better job convincing more Americans who read that editorial column if I had pointed out what I was just pointing out, you know, that we've had a de facto industrial policy in the United States since at least the late 1940s. But it didn't even occur to him to do that. It didn't even occur to Ezra Klein to do that, which is really interesting. So recognizing cultural differences, it means understanding states of mind, both of one's own and those we meet. It is the meaning of cultural awareness. One of the goals of cross-cultural training then is to alert trainees to the fact that they are constantly engaging in an activity of assigning meaning to the objects and actions that they observe. We must go beyond the defense of our own cultural model. We're all creatures of our own cultural models. So respecting cultural differences. Look for situations in one's own life that would make me behave like a person from another culture. So like a person, let's make a correction there, like a person from another culture. So that's the point I think that Trompenaars and Hampton Turner are making, that basically these romantic self-images are stereotypes. So the Americans have this romantic self-image of the rugged individualist who doesn't rely on anybody, as embodied or epitomized in the image of the cowboy. But still, at the same time, the Americans are, of course, also relying upon community identity and community needs to engage in regulating behavior in order to pursue the well-being of the community first over the well-being of the individual. And that's typically more easily justified if we talk about dealing with a foreign threat. And that foreign threat was communism during the Cold War. And now that foreign threat is still communism because, again, people like Donald Trump and Steve Bannon highlight the People's Republic of China is ruled by the Chinese Communist Party. Sure, they were our de facto ally during the Cold War against the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union is gone. And the Cold War was a long time ago. And oh yeah, by the way, do you remember that the Communist Party of China is dominating China? Communism, bad. And on that basis, we will have an industrial policy because we have to compete with China. So, and that's just the way people are. It's not just the Americans that engage in this kind of motivated reasoning and this selective perception that's self-serving. All people do it. Well, it's human nature, I should say. You and I might not do it, but people tend to do it. So yeah, he gives you an example, and I don't write out all the examples, but there was a Korean example in the reading, right? He gives you the example of a European oil company negotiating an order with a Korean supplier. Then the Korean negotiator would offer a gift, which the Europeans refused out of fear that accepting bribes while wanting to get business right away, right? So the Korean came back twice with bigger gifts because the Korean assumed that the European expected a more serious expression of wanting to establish a long-term business relationship. The Korean didn't view themselves as bribing the European. It's just that you have to exchange gifts to establish a long-term relationship. Americans, in particular, they don't understand this notion of long-term relationships, right? The European then recalled how his future wife, on their first date, reacted negatively to a minor gift he brought her, since she expected something more, since they were looking for a serious relationship. So, he was able to find something in his background to explain the way the Korean was behaving, to make sense of it. So in the future, the European communicated to the Korean that the European was interested in a good relationship, but presenting an expensive gift was not necessary to establish one. Or he might have suggested offering presents of little material value. So the point is that we should recognize that what is wrong in one culture will also likely be present some way in another culture. So again, there's an example. For example, guilt and shame cultures in Asia make people feel guilty for breaking rules may not be typical in the West. But who in the West has not wished that the group that had failed in some way would publicly discuss how some embarrassing failure happened? So, Americans, they tend to break rules if they think they're necessary in order to achieve an objective. If they fail to achieve the objective, then typically the Americans are more likely to cover it up and not assign blame. But the point is that we need to be more focused upon being open about our failures. I think that's the recollection of that example. I have to go back and check. We should recognize, therefore, that all cultural differences exist within ourselves, even if we have not yet recognized them. That's that selective perception that people tend to engage in, because we have these romantic images of what the perfect American is, or the perfect German, or the perfect Cambodian, or the perfect Korean. So we need to do this in order to develop respect for each other. Again, another example that he brings up, the example of the Japanese, who will always say yes, which seems to be mysterious. They never say no, even when they should say no. But the point is that they want to avoid open conflict, to avoid hurting feelings. And this is something we all do. Not just Japanese, Americans, everybody does. So understand the Japanese have a frail sense of self, so they are very careful to avoid inadvertently offending someone. So we should do the same if we were then in Japan. And as we move towards accommodating and empathizing with different cultures, not everyone will globalize in this way. Only some members of a national culture will be willing to abandon central cultural tenets. Okay. But you don't want to abandon your own identity and your own cultural tenets. People who tend to abandon their home cultures become weakened and corrupt. Foreigners need to be themselves if partnerships are going to work. Difference is what makes relationships possible. Therefore, we need to reconcile differences. We need to be ourselves, but understanding other perspectives can help us understand our own. Okay, so 10 steps towards achieving cultural reconciliation under the following headings. We need to perceive complementarity, use humor, we need to map out a cultural space, express dilemmas as processes using present participles. That means words ending in ing, reconciling, mitigating, integrating, ing, those are participles. Dovetailing object language and meta language, applying frames and contexts, sequencing values, visualizing values as waveforms, synergizing and virtuous circling, summarizing the process, the double helix. So again, this is typically how you deal with cultural differences in a large company that has international elements to it, or is a global company that has different national units as part of it. You know, it seems to me, I haven't investigated, but I have to imagine that Hyundai in Alabama operates and works differently, Hyundai in Alabama than Hyundai in Shanghai or Hyundai somewhere in China, even though they're all part of Hyundai. So perceiving complementarity, 7 value dimensions. They are not separate, but different, operating on a continuum. They are complementary. The exceptions that make cultures unique exist because of these 7 dimensions, which are therefore complementary. So for example, yes, I add individualism serving a group interest and communitarianism serving individual interest. Using humor. Humor often makes us aware of dilemmas by highlighting an unexpected clash between 2 perspectives, indicating that both ideals on the virtue dimension are present in the situation. Yeah, humor is useful, right? Humor is useful in terms of achieving this reconciliation and motivating people and lowering the defenses of people to accept this integration, reconciliation, and compromise. So mapping out a cultural space, the long-term and short-term dilemma versus long-term dilemma. In intercultural encounters within a company, personnel frequently complain about excessive rivalry and the inability to harmonize the efforts of different units that represent different cultures. And so, you know, I don't really go into it here, but, you know, I wrote a paper on this case of Renault Nissan that got published recently, highlighting this as an example of Renault is a French company in which the French government has a stake, has a shareholder stake. Nissan, of course, is a big Japanese company that's a de facto national champion. And this has been in the news for a few years, the conflict that emerged around Charles Ghosn, the French, Lebanese, Brazilian CEO who got in trouble because the Japanese authorities claimed that he was stealing money, or in effect, it looked like that they were concerned that Charles Ghosn was serving French interests at the expense of the Japanese interests. So, but I won't go into it here. So here's their, you know, this book is meant to be read by people from many different cultures, so they use a lot of pictures in this book, right? So there's the universal truth of headquarters and the pluralism of local initiatives. So there's Hyundai headquarters in South Korea, and then there, of course, there's local initiatives at Hyundai Alabama, Hyundai Shanghai, Hyundai Mexico, right? And of course, you're supposed to reconcile Hyundai Alabama's ideas and developments and integrate that with the universal truth supposedly the universalism of the headquarters of Hyundai located in Seoul. So the headquarters is not supposed to just impose a standard set of policies and procedures that are very constricting on Hyundai Alabama, Hyundai Mexico, and Hyundai China. It won't work. It won't be competitive. And you'll lose in this highly competitive global marketplace. So, and then another example, another picture that they have here, achievement versus ascription. Like, because Americans are supposed to be all about achievement. Americans and their romantic self-image that they have of America and Americans. I don't care about anything but your demonstrated ability to perform. The status you get from me depends upon demonstrating what you're able to do. And that's a romantic stereotype versus ascription, where, you know, of course, what college did you go to? What was your family? Is your family a famous, well-known family? That's more prominent, say, in Europe and in Asia. And of course, again, as you all know, because students have brought it up this semester, right? Even the Americans still know ascription is important, even if they have this romantic image on one side of their brain about the cowboy and demonstrating your ability to perform being the only factor that is important. So those American celebrities bribing individuals to try to get their children into high status, ascribed status universities like Stanford and Harvard, because they know the university you go to means a lot for your future, even if you're not very bright. And you don't have to be very bright to get into these best schools if your family has a history with that. Like I told you, I think at least 1/4, maybe more, of the positions open to students to come to Harvard every year go to students whose parents or grandparents graduated from Harvard. They automatically get in, even if they're not necessarily the brightest students around. Or if you give a lot of money, if you're a donor and you give a lot of money to Harvard, and then you have a child or a nephew who wants to go to Harvard, that's going to count. Even if your child is not the brightest, even if that child is not the brightest or most skilled person in the world. And so we need to, in terms of what's the element they use? The example they use is research and development, right? So in terms of achievement versus ascription, right? The commitment to research and development as a learning process, they call that ascription, versus identification with products accomplishment, achievement. So the point they're making, for example, is that you might focus upon developing the best products in the world, but unless you focus on being recognized as satisfying the needs of your clients, you can develop the best products in the world that nobody wants to buy. That's the example that Trump and Hampton Turner used. That you know, if you focus upon, you know, our job is to make the best product in the field of anything, in cement mixers, in most efficient, most developed, most effective cement mixers in the world. But you don't consult with the people that actually use and buy and use your cement mixers in terms of what their expectations are, then you're going to make a new product nobody wants to buy, or not enough people want to buy. But at the same time, you want to appeal to these people by showing them or offering them your new developments and new designs in your cement mixer or car or semiconductor or anything, and try to shape their preferences by offering them new developments and insights that your research and development department created. So you have to reconcile these two. But it's interesting that they place the satisfying customer demands as achievement versus coming up with new advances in product design and product development as ascription. But you have to reconcile and work with those two and use the two to have long-term success. And then another dilemma, dilemma C, is between short and long-termism. In terms of on the one axis, the market demands a quick response, and U.S. shareholders look for good returns every quarter, right? So, for example, U.S. companies report their profitability once every 3 months. There's 4 quarters in a year, 3 months. That's very short term. And investors want a short term. They want to make investments. They want to see profitability every 3 months. But of course, that's a problem if you have to make a long-term commitment to a project. And that might be one of the benefits of an industrial strategy. An industrial strategy is a more long-term approach. And the Germans and other countries and with different economic and financial systems, they have tried to promote more long-term approach in the development of their country by providing long-term incentives beyond every 3 months, the way the US stock market is focused. So, again, responsive to immediate opportunity, that's short term, versus vision and perseverance, that's long term. The vision, when you say vision, now we're talking about industrial strategy. And that means you have to be aware of what or decide upon what the trends are pointing towards the future, right? But that's a claim by opponents of industrial strategy that government is not really effective. Supposedly, at least the American government is not effective in that. Even so, I remember when the internet first began, I remember in the late 1970s being taken to a university to play around with on the first email system that was emerging at the time. And that's an example. That was developed, the internet was developed by the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency as a means by which universities under contract from the Defense Department, working as research institutions for the US Defense Department, to communicate with each other in a university network through email, through the computer system, to communicate with each other. There was no customer demand for that. There weren't potential customers saying, "Hey, you American universities, why don't you come up with a way by which for us to communicate over computer system and the telephone lines?" Nobody was demanding that. But these institutions were developing that capacity partly to coordinate the research activity. Also, the Defense Department was interested in developing a communication system that would survive military attack. Like, how would military institutions, including research institutions, continue to communicate with each other if there is a war going on, including possibly a nuclear war? And so there was this effort to develop this thing that became the internet. But there was no customer demand for that in terms of the marketplace demanding it. But it was generated, it was created through research and development. And guess what? Customers realized that, hey, this is a great thing. We can use this and develop this. So again, it highlights how you can shape client and customer preferences by presenting them with new products that they hadn't thought about or they hadn't considered. But that requires some vision, some long-term focus goal, like we have to win the Cold War against the Soviet Union, that is a vicious totalitarian country that wants to go to war and will go to war if it thinks it can win a nuclear war. So we need to prepare for that. That's our vision, and that produced the research and development that produced a product that, oh my gosh, then other customers came to like and use. And that goes, there's so many products that were like that, including the semiconductor. Again, the semiconductor was developed to build equipment to get to the moon. And then certainly lots of clients and customers found that to be really useful. So expressing dilemmas as processes using present participles. What do they mean there? A value is not a person, place, or thing, but we can confuse ourselves by using nouns to refer to processes. So convert noun names into present participles to capture that value dimensions are processes, which is their essential nature, rather than just a static thing that they're processes. So that's a present participles in English syntax and grammar are ing words. Universalizing versus particularizing. Individualizing versus communing. Specifying, analyzing versus diffusing, synthesizing. Communicating neutrality versus communicating emotion. So the point is to emphasize process. I'm communicating now to you. Achieving versus ascribing. Rather than say achievement versus description. Don't say achievement versus description. Think achieving versus ascribing. Sequencing time versus synchronizing time. It's easier to reconcile them if you think of them as processes, because processes implies dynamic functioning that you can intervene in and shape and influence as a process. Directing oneself from inside versus going with the flow of the environment. Processes emphasize the participation of people, and processes mingle with culture showing predominances along a continuum in a yin-yang interactive process. So when I say yin-yang, that's like East Asia. And Trompenars, he really likes yin-yang thinking. Dovetailing object language and meta language. So it means identifying one situation and labeling it, that's language, while conceptualizing the process to change it, meta language. So I think again, this focus upon dynamic intervention to change it. Okay, so I'd have to go back and look at that. I'm trying to recall an example of that. Identifying one situation, labeling it language while conceptualizing the process to change it. So process means there should be a process involved. Again, Americans are all about process. That's a theme in that Ezra Klein opinion editorial I highlighted, right? So the Americans, they do have a focus on process. He's emphasizing, however, that I think in that Ezra Klein editorial we covered at the beginning of class, that there needs to be more of a vision, a national focus, like there was during the Cold War. We have to win the Cold War against the Russian version of Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union. And that guided and oversaw everything. Get to the moon first before the Soviets do. So we've got conflicts. We've got to reconcile them in the name of victory in the Cold War. We've got to get to the moon first. We've got to beat China. We've got to contain China. I mean, for good or bad, you need an overarching strategic desired future to guide these processes, to limit these processes, to shape these processes. And in the case of Germany and Japan and Spain, guess what? All of those countries are and South Korea, they are late developers. They're called late developers. What do I mean by late developers? That United States, Great Britain, United Kingdom, Great Britain, and the United States developed early. So there wasn't really a national strategy to develop United Kingdom, Great Britain. There wasn't really much of a national strategy to develop the United States economically, to industrialize the United States. That happened beginning at the end of the 18th century. It started, and it just sort of happened. So those are early developers. But for Germany, for France, for Japan, for South Korea, they had to explicitly address the task of how can we make our nation economically strong and prosperous as a foundation, often for military strength. It's not going to just happen spontaneously, naturally, the way it did in America and Britain. Or at least that's the image Americans have, that it's just normal to economically develop. No, Germany and Japan and Korea, they explicitly adopted strategies, and Spain, to develop as rapidly as possible to make up the lost time when they're confronting Japan or when they're confronting their adversary. Typically, it was in the context of international competition, international politics. Germany had to become strong to deal with Great Britain, which had an advantage. That Spain had to develop after being set back and being so far behind the others in developing. And there was that overarching national strategy. And this is something Americans, they just have difficulty accepting it, even when they did it during the Cold War. So applying frames and context, we can interchange the two poles in each of the 7 value continua while applying them to analyze how to reach goals of the unit or organization as we allocate resources and designate approaches to reach organizational goals. Hooray! Management does more than simply stay out of the way of a creative reconciler. It makes the whole company aware of and learn from a local success. So the point is that, for example, Hyundai in headquarters in Seoul is going to look at what Hyundai in Montgomery, Alabama does effectively and spread that awareness to Hyundai Mexico and Hyundai China and facilitate that transmission of that experience, of that success, while of course understanding that Hyundai Mexico and Hyundai China is going to have to develop and apply it to their own local conditions. But Hyundai Seoul does not issue edicts and commands about how Hyundai Montgomery, Alabama is going to address the challenges Hyundai Alabama has in being effective in the American context. So again, here's one of their pictures and a set of pictures in the book, applying frames and contexts. So things are hopeless, and the meta language, that's the situation. I am determined to make them otherwise. Particular achievements are rewarded. And so status is ascribed to this general strategy. So you just establish that if your particular achievements are successful, you are rewarded in this company. So in a sense that you ascribe status to achievements. Again, this yin yang kind of thinking, right? So, or here's a person working in a company shows a determination to solve problems. This person is then the person you send to fix bad situations when there's a bad situation in a subsidiary of your company, for example. Ascribing status to a strategy that has recently been successful makes those who emulate this strategy more likely to achieve. Okay, well, I mean, they're emphasizing this process, right? That this process this dynamic process is necessary to have continual function. continually functioning because we're dealing with a changing, turbulent global environment. And remember, this book is pretty much written before the pandemic starts. And this pandemic has had a tremendous impact on corporations and businesses everywhere around the world. As revealed, for example, in the discussion about how to deal with the disruption of global supply chains. And that's not covered in this book, but it's a big topic for the last 2.5, 3 years now, 2.5 years. How do companies respond to that? How do they learn from their different components and suppliers and some contractors to respond to this? And that there is a lot of coverage of that in the business media. How are companies responding to this turmoil and turbulence of the pandemic? A lot of companies just go bankrupt. And you tend not to hear too much about them because they're failures. The media, the business media, at least in the United States, covers the success stories about how a company shifted and developed its product line to reflect, for example, what its customers need in this time of emergency. And voila, we have new success, new products, new orientations. How did that happen? It's been a big focus of topic in the American business media, in print and in broadcasting over the last 2 years. And it's really not covered in your Trompenaar's book, because the Trompenaar's book was, you can tell, was finished when it was pretty much finished when the pandemic started. And now everybody has these big challenges about having to respond to change that's rapidly accelerating. And now it's accelerating even more with the crisis over Ukraine, the obstruction to export of food supplies to the world, rising food prices, the disruption to commodities coming out of Russia and Ukraine that's needed for many other manufacturing agricultural processes. The shift from Russian oil and gas. So again, sequencing values, sequencing processes over time is necessary in order to correct situations perceived as ineffective. Again, more yin and yang type discussions. Visualizing waves as values as waveforms. So I don't know, do I have any pictures here? Yeah, so it views the 7 value dimensions with their ideal poles as waveforms. Again, this need to get feedback, to deal with feedback and accommodate it, not resist it, utilize it. You have to correct many small errors, but first acknowledge them in this dynamic process, learning by error. To improve rules, we must first be able to refute them. And we cannot appreciate what is outstanding and unique without knowing what the common standards are. But these common standards have to include profit margins. So what does he say here? Here's the figure. The better I sleep, the more awake I am, right? So the better I sleep, the more awake I am when I'm awake. Or consider music on various frequencies, right? Well, what's the point here? You want to harmonize sound frequencies. Again, this yin and yang thinking is the big focus here. You try something, you make an error, you correct it, and you continue on this process. If you focus upon never making a mistake, you're not going to be adaptable. You don't want to, however, you want to have common standards to avoid a catastrophic mistake that will make you go bankrupt. So you want to universalize particular cases of success. The one way is the best way is one extreme. I'm unique is the other extreme. You have to universalize the particular cases of success in this feedback process. Okay, so synergizing virtuous circles, again, more of this yin yang thinking. And so So for example, ascribing great importance to a big infrastructure project, which lead to the high levels of achieving being attained, which lead to a next project, right? So, I mean, I think, again, the case of the industrial strategy of South Korea, global Korea, right? That Korea made a commitment years ago, partly under the influence of the United States, because the United States is so influential in South Korea, right? Given the history of the United States here, particularly since 1945, right? That, digital economy needs to be a focus of the development of Korea and as the next stage. So that's a big project. And it's been quite successful, right? In terms of one of the successes of South Korea includes its ability to be successful in global media environment that is heavily influenced by streaming. So for example, what's the big Korean content or show that's been really popular? It's on streaming services, on internet streaming video services, what Squid Game, right? To make products for entertainment that are particularly adept or useful for streaming. I mean, that's an example. Korea is just an excellent example of this kind of ascribing great importance to a big infrastructure project, partly because, South Korea follows or looks to what the United States is doing so much to develop its own strategy. And, you can say, well, yeah, of course, digital economy, that's obviously very important. Keep in mind that South Korea has done better in many ways in the United States in terms of its digital infrastructure. I mean, I read yesterday that the speed of the US internet is about the same. It's like one of the lowest in the world. It's about the same level as Thailand. Who has the fastest internet in the world, or at least did until when last time I checked a couple years ago? South Korea. So South Korea is even doing better in the digital economy and digital infrastructure than the Americans are, even though they got that insight that this is the next big, one of the next big frontiers of the development of the national economy from the Americans. And they've surpassed the Americans. Biotech, I just recall when the pandemic began, there was this rush to develop vaccines, of course. Moderna developed its vaccine even before, I read this yesterday, right? That Moderna developed its vaccine formula 2 days before the World Health Organization declared the pandemic over 2 years ago, in February 2020. So Korea made a commitment to biotech years ago, right? That there's this biotech lab that was built here that opened up several years ago. That began, but of course, let me get to the point. There was a lot of discussion in the media that there was hope that Korea would be able to develop its own COVID-19 vaccines. And there was some reporting that Korea and Japan were a little bit late in getting access to vaccines because they were hoping that Korean companies and Japanese companies would develop their own vaccines. But evidently that there was, I remember reading, there was speculation that they were a little bit slow in getting the vaccines because they hoped that they would be able to use the opportunity to develop their own biotech infrastructure and use the crisis of generating vaccines against COVID-19 as a way by which to gain the next stage of Korea's national economic development. And I only really have time to read the American media, but I don't see much reporting on South Korea developing its own COVID-19 vaccines. There's licensing agreements with Novavax and others, but there was this effort to develop these vaccines, but of course it hasn't really worked out as effectively as it could, or as may have been hoped. So I got my second booster of the COVID-19 vaccine and still the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine. So summarizing the processes, the double helix, I guess let's bring it all together. So again, when two worlds collide, the integration of cultures in a merger or acquisition. I guess two worlds collide, right? Mergers and acquisitions are increasing due to increasing political, monetary, and regulatory convergence. Keep in mind, they're not easy to do, right? 2 out of 3 mergers and acquisitions do not achieve anywhere near the benefits which their advocates anticipated. And the big focus of mergers and acquisitions, at least until recently, was automobile companies. And I don't know if it's really done. I mean, I haven't heard more mergers and acquisitions since Fiat Chrysler joined with Peugeot. So relational aspects, including cultural differences and lack of trust, are responsible for 70% of merger and acquisitions failures. And again, that Renault-Nissan case is really fascinating. Even though they had this big fight between Renault and Nissan over the last couple of years, evidently Renault and Nissan are committed to making their joint partnership work, but they're not willing to merge the 2 companies. It's some kind of partnership, joint production process to pool their resources, but they won't form one company. Partly because the French don't want it to happen, and I don't think the Japanese want it to happen either, the Japanese authorities. The prescription in this textbook is dilemma thinking for addressing the problem. It aims to bring people together, discover what they share and how they differ. So again, more pictures. So you want to work together, the unicorn and the bear. Yay! You don't want the unicorn dragging the bear, and you don't want the bear obstructing the unicorn. Unicorns are supposedly good, right? Unicorns are tremendous success stories. So how do you manage the traditional bear with the fantastic unicorn? And you have to work together. Hooray! Let me see here. Integrating opposites as a continuous and creative dialogue. Many areas will display these similar dilemmas in the integration process. That is, human resources, internet technology, loyalty programs, or finance. So the dilemma reconciliation process outlined here generates so-called creative space. The ultimate solution can be significantly better than an initial one-dimensional solution. It is the area in which synergies are realized, a process of dialogue between different organizational units that is very intense and rewarding can emerge within both operating companies and holding companies. So future integration processes are likely in the future, so recognition of the value of this dialogue often offers a significant contribution. So a holding company means a company that has stock in another company, right? People are able to achieve these types of synergy because they're good at reconciling values that are seemingly oppose or are seemingly opposite, and not because they're good at choosing one side over the other. A new enriched reality emerges from integrating 2 desirable aims which were in tension. The issue is not whether choosing a sales or service culture would make a better company, but rather the challenge lies in discovering how we can develop a more sophisticated service culture so that the company can sell more and vice versa. Organizations will create competitive advantage if they are able to reconcile their differences. If not, they're going to be among the 70% of mergers and acquisitions that fail. Keep in mind, companies, are so aware of this importance of mergers and acquisitions. I know somebody who works as a corporate lawyer for an automobile parts company that is headquartered in Ohio in Toledo, Dana Corporation, and it makes automobile parts. And it's on the Fortune 500 list of companies, big companies in the world. So it's in the top 500 companies in the world. And you can imagine what this company is going through as the world is shifting to electric vehicles. And they have a department called mergers and acquisitions that this company knows it has to engage in merger and acquisition activity to be successful and thrive. And keep that in mind that up until now, 70% of mergers and acquisitions don't work. despite the best intentions of the people involved. And that's cultural differences. Miscommunication due to lack of trust. This process will encourage these parties to engage in a creative dialogue rather than just complaining about each other in the corridor. And then, of course, they want you to buy their software, the corporate culture profiler for cultural dilemmas. And so what's this here? So in terms of mergers and acquisitions of these different types of companies, and keep that in mind, right? You got Fiat, which emerged with Chrysler, but Chrysler was bankrupt when Fiat took it over. Now merging with Peugeot, which is a French company, that's an Eiffel Tower company. Is it going to work? I don't know. I mean, I haven't researched it. So in terms of reconciling these cultures, guided missile versus family, we need to cut costs whenever we can for the sake of our shareholders' return versus we need to invest for long-term sustainability. So family is more long-term focused. We need to supply global or standardized product services versus we need to supply product services that respond to local tastes and needs, right? And we need to develop our people versus we need to keep people focused on delivering results. Eiffel Tower versus family. We need to focus on the human element and take advantage of the experience of managing diversity versus we need to enhance a culture of leading edge engineering autonomy. Guided missile versus family. We need to develop looser controls and greater management empowerment versus we need to develop tight top-down controls and more restricted procedures. So these are the dilemmas you face. 6, our leadership style should be more participative and empowering versus our leadership style should be more decisive and directive. So, oh, this is their software. Sorry, they're highlighting their software that they want you to buy. What about the personal values of the key players, the leaders, the bosses? The values of the top leadership of the respective organizations should become a topic of how to reconcile the values at stake after the dilemmas are formulated at stake, sorry. After the dilemmas are formulated and validated in terms of the differences in corporate and possibly other cultures. So the values of the top leadership of the respective organization should become a topic of how to reconcile the values at stake after the dilemmas are formulated and validated in terms of the differences in corporate and possibly other cultures. So you have mergers and acquisitions. You have different leaderships. What are you going to do with these different leaderships? How are you going to merge them? And so you should be a focus on how to reconcile the different values at stake in terms of restructuring the new company that emerges out of the merger and acquisition. That's how you assign leadership positions, how you develop the new organizational structure. I mean, I would, now that I talk about it, I would really like to know more about how this Peugeot Fiat Chrysler mergers is happening. The process begins by profiling the values of the leadership group and those who directly report to them. The commitment of the leadership groups to values and behavior change has to be gained. So there has to be change. So Fiat Chrysler cannot continue to act just like Fiat Chrysler when it merges with Peugeot, and Peugeot cannot continue to act like Peugeot the same way it acted before it merged with Fiat Chrysler. There needs to be change. What matters for the individual and what matters for the organization need increasingly be congruent. And so they give you an example of this, right? For example, of a person who goes into nursing because she loves, her personal values focus on helping people, but the reality of the corporate culture are very different due to its environment in a high poverty, high crime area, working in a public hospital, most concerned with not getting sued. So, I mean, that's part of the reality of working in an organization. And I'm thinking about that myself, right? I mean, here I am, a teacher at Catholic University of Korea, a professor, and I have to reconcile my own personal objectives and ideals with the intense competition of Catholic University of Korea with all the other universities in South Korea. And they are an intense competition. And that means I have to modify my expectations and conform. Okay, so final selection values. Lastly, a final decision must be taken regarding the core values within the context of the envisioned future and key purpose of the organization. The chosen values need to be instrumental for the achievement of the goals which have been set for the organization. Alternative approaches to selecting the core values for an organization include the following. Value selection according to helping achieve the reconciliation of key business dilemmas. Value selection according to helping achieve the reconciliation of key cultural dilemmas. Value selection according to giving life to purpose. And value selection as an extension of personal values. So keep that in mind. Values in this Trompenaar's book refers to ideals of what our company or organization stands for. So you need to have a statement of what your company stands for and is aiming to actualize. And you need to be explicit about that. And you typically are. You know, for example, if you take more classes in business administration, you're going to talk about strategic management. You're going to talk about business strategy formulation. How do you come up with a mission statement for your organization? What's the process by which you come up with a mission statement that the elements of the organization accept and internalize? Values. Values arise from functionality and success speeds them. You do what you're good at. And you commit to doing what you're good at. Explicitly through your value statement. You're typically your organization's mission statement. The quality of a core value can be best demonstrated by its relevance to help solve the key dilemmas business leaders face. And that's typically going to be, again, in your mission statement. I mean, all organizations today, they're supposed to have mission statements. Values need to support the dilemma reconciliation process. So what values and behaviors do we need to develop to reconcile this dilemma? So values as constructs to aid the reconciliation of key cultural dilemmas. Again, that depends upon your situation, right? In terms of the kind of cultures you're working in. The issues, in addition to functionality, witnessing all parties engaging around a shared reality that we want to create together is satisfying rather than focusing only on differences. So again, there's a lot of focus in strategic business administration on getting buy-in and creating a process for formulating the mission statement of an organization, because it's the process by which you get the different elements of the organization to communicate with each other and internalize, at least, and hopefully agree on or develop a consensus about what we're all trying to do here. Values as an extension of personal values. It is wise to start from the leader's own values and reason from that position. You know, so for example, you might hear people say, well, you know, I hire the leader to give us the chief executive officer. They're supposed to provide the business strategy, right? They're the leader. That's why they get all that big money. They're supposed to provide leadership. Lead, tell us what we should be doing. And it's not really how it works. The values and vision of the leader is important, but you have to come up with a process in that organization in order to convince people, persuade people that they are having a dialogue, which they're having an input, and that they should be persuaded that the outcome of that process is something they want to be enthusiastic about and internalize. And if not, they should leave. But you got to be careful how you put that. Again, we're still talking about mergers and acquisitions here. So you have different organizations with different mission, different organizational mission statements, and you're trying to merge them. And it's not easy to do. right? So you start with the leader's values and reason from that position. The situation applies if the merged organizations have such different histories and so many vested interests. So they're always vested interests, right? And people don't like changing the way they do things. I mean, they've made commitments by doing what they think they were supposed to do. They've done them this way, and now they're supposed to change. And they've established their positions. They've established their status in the organization. They've established their familiarities, their routines, their comfort zones. And now this all has to begin to change. And they're going to resist because can be stressful. It can be threatening. It can make my work time, my experience in the organization more stressful. The new company has to start, therefore, from a clean slate. I mean, there's reasons why 70% of mergers and acquisitions don't work. And they don't work because the people in the organization enough don't like the changes that are being requested or demanded of them. And so they resist in different ways. Until, like, Chrysler finally goes bankrupt. And then Fiat comes in and picks up the pieces from the dead corporate body. So continuous reevaluation means monitoring change through the high performance culture. The specific situation will determine the progress and speed of the integration. And the integration will require tailored plans, interventions on monitoring systems. Checklists can be integrated into the ongoing employer engagement surveys, and human resources can play an important role. So what's this? There's a website. Let's click on the website. Where does it take us? Is it going to let me go? Let me see. Maybe not. Well, my computer's apparently not letting me go to the site. So, that's interesting. Uh-oh, what did I do? Did I break my computer? Let me see what I gotta do here. Force quit. Okay, so yeah, I had to close that file, it wasn't working. Okay, so restart Microsoft Word. And so let's do another interesting exercise that came up in terms of cultural differences and cultural change. That's more the topic, cultural change in South Korea. So here's again a New York Times article that came up, and I want to show it to you here. And so we go here to share screen, and we click here. That's it. And okay, so okay, so it says here, this is from this was in the Business Financial Desk. This is the business section of the New York Times. And Cho Sang-hun, who is, I think, the bureau chief for the New York Times in South Korea, he's been there forever. He notes here in this report from just a few days ago, South Koreans, this is the summary, South Koreans live with an enormous tolerance for abuse. And the powerful, said one famously bullied advocate, a backlash has erupted. So it goes on here. Let's go through this. So a boss orders a worker to feed and clean up after his dog. An airline heiress makes a taxiing passenger plane return to the gate to remove a flight attendant who rubbed her the wrong way. The 10-year-old grandmother of a newspaper tycoon hurls insults at her chauffeur, threatening to fire him for being spoiled. Such behavior has become so common in South Korea that the country now has a name for it, kapchil. The word is a portmanteau for when kap mean people with power and abuse ul, those who work for them. And in South Korea's deeply hierarchical society, where one's social standing is determined by profession, job title, and wealth, hardly anyone has escaped its claws. More recently, though, CUK has triggered a backlash. On websites, street banners, and even stickers in public bathrooms, government agencies, the police, civic groups, and corporations are offering CUK hotlines, encouraging citizens to blow the whistle on officials and bosses who abuse their authority. Using bullying language, often offering bribes, preying on subcontractors, and failing to pay workers on time are all examples of CUK. On college campuses, students are hanging placards accusing CUK professors of sexual harassment. The campaigns appear to be working. Politicians, senior government officials, and corporate bigwigs have all seen their reputations ruined after CUK scandals. The public has swelled with pride and a good dose of schadenfreude while watching the rich and powerful fall from grace for being, well, jerks. CUK became an election issue during the presidential campaign. The wife of Lee Jae-myung, a leading candidate, was forced to apologize after she was accused of treating government officials as though they were her personal servants, having to pick up takeout food and do her holiday shopping while Mr. Lee was a provincial governor. Mr. Lee lost the election by a razor-thin margin. South Koreans live with an enormous tolerance for abuse, but when they can't take it anymore and explode, they call it CUK, said Park Chang-jin, a former Korean air flight attendant who campaigns against CUK as a leader of the small opposition Justice Party. Mr. Park knows the feeling. In 2014, Cho Hyun-ah, the daughter of the former Korean Air Chairman Cho Yang-ho, forced a passenger jet taxiing at Kennedy International Airport in New York to return to the gate because she didn't like the way the macadamia nuts were served to her in first class. Mr. Park and another flight attendant were made to kneel before Mrs. Cho, who let the plane depart only after Mr. Park had been kicked off the plane. The Korean Air family became the epitome of CUK again in 2018 when audio and video files emerged showing another daughter, Cho Hyun-min, and her mother, Lee Myung-hee, screaming insults at workers. The chairman had to apologize and banish both of his daughters from management positions at the company. There was a time when South Koreans were more likely to tolerate such behavior, especially when it involved the super rich families who run the country's business conglomerates known as chaebol, said Park Chung-kyu, an official of CUK 119, a civic group that offers legal advice for victims. But people now demand higher standards on what behavior is acceptable and what is not, Mr. Park said. Now, when someone says to an authority figure, "Are you going to CUK to me?" the accusation packs a punch. South Korea has one of the longest work weeks among the world's wealthier nations, and CUK is often cited as one of the reasons behind the country's miserable work conditions. The phenomenon takes many forms like excessive hours with no overtime and bullying by supervisors. I hated it when they seemed to have nothing to do other than going around the office, commenting on female workers' clothes, saying that we could not get married because of the way we dress, said Hong Chae-young, referring to older male managers at her former corporate job. Miss Hong, 30, said that behavior was one of the reasons she had quit. Corporate and government elites have been notorious for a type of CUK known as imperial protocol, which includes having a row of underlings hold umbrellas or commandeer elevators when ordinary people are forced to take the stairs. In 2017, Kim Moo-sung, a political boss, became a symbol of that sort of entitlement when he rolled a suitcase at an assistant at the airport. He later became the subject of public ridicule. Some trace the origins of CUK to South Korea's military dictators who enforced a command and compliance culture that remains pervasive. It is both the basic grammar and a deeply rooted malaise of a South Korean society that reflects the rankism that people are addicted to, said Kang Chun-man, a media scholar, wrote in his book on CUK. People who suffer CUK at work commit CUK themselves when they are in the position of authority, as when they talk to a call center employee on the phone, said Cho Ni, 37, who quit a stationery factory in April because of her manager's abusive language. But the company's march toward democracy is also filled with stories of rebellion against the powerful, citizens driving a dictator into exile, taking up arms against the military junta, and holding massive rallies to win the right to free election. The impeachment of President Park Geun-hye in 2017 was started when it was revealed that her secret advisor, Choi Soon-sil, was accused of forcing an elite university to change its admissions policy to accept her daughter. Money speaks, the daughter said in a Facebook comment that triggered public outrage. The recent trend of whistleblowing on Kapchil also reflects a deep mistrust of the justice system in South Korea, where many have said that courts rarely punish corporate elites who act as though they are above the law. In 2007, Kim Seung-hyun, chairman of Hanwha conglomerate, was imprisoned only briefly after assaulting workers. And in 2010, Chae Cho-hwan, a member of the family that ran the SK conglomerate, received only a suspended prison sentence after battering a union activist with an aluminum baseball bat. When victims of Kapchil exhaust resources to address their grievances legally, they often result to exposing abusers in the court of public opinion, usually with the help of camera phones and social media. In 2018, video footage emerged of Yang Jun-ho, the head of an online file sharing company, ruthlessly slapping a former employee. In 2017, audio files emerged of Yi Jang-han, chairman of the pharmaceutical company Chung Ku-dang, of harassing his chauffeur with a stream of insults. "What kind of bastard your father was to have raised you, a son like you," he said. Mr. Yang was imprisoned for violence and other crimes, while Mr. Lee was forced to hold a news conference to apologize. Despite the anti-Kapchil movement, South Korea may have a long way to go to make its work environment more fair and its society more equal. A law against workplace harassment took effect in 2019, but it mandates only disciplinary actions or a financial penalty of up to $8,000 against offenders. In a survey of Kapchil 119 last year, nearly 29% of workers reported abuse at work. Kapchil is still treated as something that should be resolved within the company, said Yoon Ji-young, a human rights lawyer who helps Kapchil victims. There's a huge animosity against people who take the problem outside the company. Without more accountability, though, Mr. Park at Kapchil 119 fears little will change for South Korean workers being tormented by their abusive bosses. "We have ended the military dictatorship and we have impeached the president," he said, "but we still have to change our workplace culture." So I would like to ask you, in response to this New York Times news report, please suggest 5 to 7 research sub-questions that you would want to answer in a qualitative research study regarding Kapchil in South Korea. So sub-questions to CUK students, let's say to CUK students, that you want to answer in a qualitative research study regarding Kapchil in South Korea. Okay, so let me divide you into groups, and of course we only have 6 minutes, so of course I don't have enough time. I didn't leave enough time for this. I apologize, but let's do it anyway. So let's divide you into groups of 2 and assign automatically. Well, actually, maybe into groups of 1 because there's only 3 people. So open the room, and so please join the room. Gloria, Dae-Kwon, and Young Jun Shin, please join the group. Gloria, Dae-Kwon, and Young Jun Shin, please join the group. Gloria, Kwon-deok, join the group. Gloria, Kwon-deok, Kwon-deok. And come up with 5 to 7 questions. First draft of research questions you would create to begin to think about how to do research on this topic. Okay, and I will do it as well. And let's assign. I want to assign somebody to speak for you. So heads, it's Young Jun Shin, and it's heads. So Young Jun Shin will speak for the group. Young Jun Shin will speak for the group. And I will come up with 5 to 7 research topic questions as well to ask the group, and research sub questions. So 5 to 7 research sub questions to CUK students. So let me come up with this, and so we'll do this really fast. So Okay, I got 5 questions. So I'm going to close the breakout rooms. Young Junshin, you're going to speak, so get ready. Oh, well, everybody's out of the room. Okay, so I closed the room. Okay, so Young Junshin, what are 5 questions or some? What are some of the questions you came up with as research questions, not interview questions, sub questions for research? What are some research questions you want to investigate regarding Kapchil in Korea? You're muted. Unmute, Young Junshin. Young Junshin. Young Junshin going once. Young Junshin going twice. Can you hear me? Kwandeok, Gloria, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, Gloria, give me some questions.
With the OC, we found that we could ask something general like, did you ever feel, did you ever live like in a situation where Gaptil was harder than you imagine, or something like, do you think that ascribed status have an effect on Gaptil situation, and what could we do? Could we find another way to achieve success, and could it be decreasing the effect of Gaptil in a South Korean organization?
Okay, Kwandeok, give me some questions.
Yes, similar as with Gloria,
Yeah.
but and I want to add, have you ever experienced the capture where you worked at as part-time job, or the military, or the Korean Air or whichever company's capture made you use another airline or another options?
You know, those are interview questions, and of course, the interview questions come from your research questions, right? So I asked, you know, I suggest you first come up with the sub-research questions, the research questions you asked. So here are my first draft of 5 research questions, not interview questions, research questions, right? What is the generational differences regarding Gapchil in South Korea? So older people versus younger people, generational differences. Second question, research question. What are the socioeconomic class differences regarding how to respond to Kapchil between people that are white collar versus people that are blue collar, people that work with college degrees working in offices versus people that work in manufacturing or construction, right? Third research question, what are the gender differences regarding how to respond to Kapchil in South Korea between men and women, in other words, right? Fourth research question, what are the religious community differences regarding how to respond to Kapchil? Do Korean Christians respond differently to Kapchil than, say, Korean Buddhists or Korean Catholics? I think that's an important question, actually. I just realized that when writing out these questions, because I'm really interested in that topic, right? Fifth question, what are the urban versus rural differences? Do people respond differently to Kapchil who live in villages and work in farming versus people that work in big cities like Seoul? But that religious thing is interesting. Okay, so that's, I'm sorry, we didn't have enough time for that. I apologize. But you know, you start getting into the notes on Trump versus Hampton Turner, and I wanted to complete that because, you know, if we don't complete it, we got to come back to it. And then I have to remind everybody what we said. Maybe we will do that on Friday when we have our 1-hour class back in class again. when we meet, but it's not a lot of time, with 50 minutes to cover that material, and then we have to debate. But again, Gloria popped in here. Gloria, I wanted to show you something regarding, I showed you in the European Politics and Society class. That is, if I can find it here, no, of course it's not going to be easy. It's going to be difficult. Let me see if I can find it here. On the lesson plan, I found something that explains that ballot issue that I showed you at the last class, and I asked your help on it, but you said you don't speak Italian, so you can't really help me on it. There is a Wikipedia entry for this referendum that I have to vote on, and you can vote on too because you're an Italian citizen. It's at Wikipedia. It's on Wikipedia. There is an entry on it. Here you can see the 5 ballots that I have to fill out. Okay.
Yeah.
And so I don't know what to do, but you know what I probably would do, and I would do this. I talk about this in the American politics and other classes. I'm going to look to somebody whom I trust to tell me what to do. And I identify with the Democratic Party in Italy, led by the former Prime Minister Letta. And you can say they want me to vote no, 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 no on all 5 of those ballots. So that's probably what I will do as the default position because it's easy to do.
Mhm.
So anyway, I just wanted to show you there is a Wikipedia site for this, and that has really been helpful. But that's all for today, okay? So, bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.